The roster cutdown has begun for the Orioles. They free up some space for not just some guys who needed to be added, but also the potential big-time additions in the offseason. We'll talk about all the recent roster moves coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Tuesday, November 11th, 2025, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and now the #1 sports podcast network. As always, I am your host, Connor Newcomb, and today we're going to run down a bunch of just Orioles roster moves that happened over the past 3 or 4 days or so. We'll talk about another waiver claim in Pedro León, who the Orioles claimed. We'll talk about Anthony Nunez being added to the 40-man roster, and we'll talk about all the space the Orioles had to clear off that 40-man back on Friday to get some space for the guys like Andrew Kittredge and the waiver claims and players coming back off the 60-day injured list. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. So apologies again. You do a daily podcast here when you're under the weather for a few days. It continues to affect multiple shows. It may affect this one as well. I apologize. I'm hopefully on the upswing here from whatever non-COVID was going on, but you can probably hear it a little bit in my voice. The stuffiness is certainly still hitting me, but there was plenty of Orioles roster moves that happened over the weekend. We didn't get a chance to get to them on the Monday show because the Orioles also hired a hitting coach, and we had a nice guest, Matt Saluski, joining us on yesterday's episode to talk about Dustin Lind, who the Orioles hired away from the Phillies to be their new hitting coach. The entire episode about him was up yesterday. Make sure to go back and check that one out. But before that, the O's had made a ton of moves. And basically, this is just going to be the roster move roundup from the past week or so. So let's begin with the one waiver claim the Orioles have made since the last time we talked about one. That is 27-year-old right-handed hitting outfielder Pedro León, who the Orioles claimed off waivers from the Houston Astros earlier this week on Friday. Now, León was at one point a pretty big-time prospect. And if you would have asked Astros fans just a couple of years ago, they really couldn't have foreseen just kind of throwing Pedro León at age 27 on waivers like this. He was signed out of Cuba in 2021. The Astros gave him a $4 million signing bonus to come from Cuba. Now, he was already older. A lot of these players that come from Cuba are a little bit older. He was already 23 years old. So the Astros immediately stuck him in Double-A. He did well, and he ended that first season in AAA in 2021, and the Astros were like, if this goes well, by the end of 2022, we might have a major leaguer just, 2 years basically after we signed him in an international class. But instead, León kind of stalled out for the next 3 seasons. He played in AAA for the Astros and had some stretches, but never really quite got going until 2024, when he finally broke out at the AAA level. Now, to be fair, he was already 26 years old at that point, but the bat finally came around. In 118 games in AAA in 2024, he hit .299 with a .372 on base and a .514 slugging, hit 24 homers, stole 29 bases, and had a .130 WRC plus at the AAA level. He also had a max exit velocity of 117.5 miles per hour off the bat, which was one of the 5 hardest hit balls by any AAA hitter in 2024. He posted a really good 11.4% barrel rate, a really solid 43% hard hit rate, and his pull air rate of 26% is elite. That's along with some of the best home run hitters in Major League Baseball that pull the ball in the air that much. Remember, pulling the ball in the air leads to the most extra base hits and home runs. Now, you say all that, and you're like, Connor, how did he not get a bigger chance at the big leagues? Well, he still ran a strikeout rate of 27%. That's pretty high. He still ran a swing and miss rate of 32%. That's even more concerning, especially being at only the AAA level. So the Astros knew the tools were in there, but they still had a pretty solid team in 2024 that, despite not having the best year, they still did make the postseason and still had a pretty solid lineup and didn't have much of a chance for León to play. But when they did have an opening, they finally called him up to make his major league debut in August of 2024. He played in 7 games for the Astros, went 2 for 20 with 10 strikeouts at the plate, and after that was sent right back down to AAA when the Stros got a little bit healthier and spent the remainder of the season in AAA, did not come back to the big leagues. León began again. Now, he was on the 40-man roster this time, but did begin the 2025 season back in AAA as well. But really, for the first time since the Astros signed him out of Cuba, the injuries started to become a factor. He sprained his MCL in his left knee and ended up playing just 22 AAA games this season, mostly in August and September, missed essentially the first 3 to 4 months of the season with that injury. Now, he is only 5'9", but he is like a super tooled up, huge pull side power, really good speed. Not the greatest outfielder in the world, but could certainly play out there. Unfortunately, just with all those tools and all the reasons the Astros signed him for $4 million out of Cuba 4 years ago, he's just never really put it all together. Now, however, this is not an Astros Mike Elias guy, right? He was signed in 2021. Elias left the Astros in 2018, but Elias obviously knows people over there who signed Pedro León. And also, this is a guy who is still 27, is still in the ages where he could be peaking, still is hitting the ball just as hard as he was, even despite the injury this season, and seems to be healthy because he did come back at the end of the year, and he has big league options. Now, it's more than likely that at some point, probably soonish in this offseason, right, the Orioles will also DFA Pedro León because he's sitting right around the bottom of their 40-man roster, and we know the Orioles are going to make additions to this roster via trade and free agency. He's probably going to be one of the first ones to go, but the O's are going to try to pass him through waivers and get him to stick in the organization in AAA off the 40-man and see if they can work with him. Because if he can survive, until opening day, at least in the organization, even if he's not on the 40-man, you can place a guy in Norfolk who gives you depth and is kind of an optionable weapon where there's still a lot to be gotten out of this guy, right? Like, there is a lot of what I think the Orioles saw in Jeremiah Jackson when they signed him last offseason in Pedro León. I think there's a lot of the traits that the Orioles saw in Ryan O'Hearn when they claimed him on waivers a couple of years ago. O'Hearn had a good amount more big league time than León did, but still the exact amount of basically zero success in that big league time. So there's always a chance here. And again, it's another depth move where if it doesn't work out, it's whatever. You got a guy who's filling in some at-bats in AAA and you release him at some point. But if it does work, you get a cheap, maybe utility option who has, I think, some still punch in that bat. And there's a good chance that, again, he's already 27. It may never work. But there's also a chance because he has all the tools, maybe getting with some Orioles hitting coaches, maybe with, he'd been with one organization, the Astros, the entire time, maybe with some new voices in his ear, they can find a way to tweak things a little bit to get a lot more out of his bat because it's always been in there. He's never really been able to fully put it together and get himself to the big leagues. Now, León was not the only player who the Orioles added to the 40-man roster late last week. The other one was, I would say, a lot more exciting, and that is Anthony Nunez. We'll tell you about him coming up after this. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Game Time. The NFL season is back, and honestly, there's nothing better than being in the stadium surrounded by fans cheering on your team. But let's be honest, getting tickets can be a hassle. Between queues, login screens, and prices jumping at checkout, it's frustrating. That's why I use Game Time, the app that gives the advantage back to fans. Game Time is fast, it's easy, and it's backed by the Game Time guarantee. You'll always get 100% authentic tickets delivered on time and at the best price. Plus, all fees are included, so the price you see is the price you pay. I can pull up Game Time in just a couple of taps, see amazing deals. I'm thinking about going to my first Ravens game in almost 10 years, maybe seeing Ravens Jets in a couple of weeks. Got great deals on Game Time for Ravens game under $100. So download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, that's promo code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Swipe, tap, ticket, go. Download Game Time today. So the Orioles did make another addition to their 40-man roster last week, and that was 24-year-old right-handed reliever Anthony Nunez, who was added to the 40-man roster on Friday. Now, Nunez had already been in the Orioles organization, but he was Rule 5 draft eligible for the first time this offseason, which means the Orioles had until kind of the middle of next week, I believe is that deadline. I think it's on the 18th, that the Orioles have to choose between all these prospects who are Rule 5 eligible and who are not on the 40-man. You either add them to the 40-man roster, then they are not available in the Rule 5 draft, or you don't add them, and other teams can scoop them up in the Rule 5 draft, what happens later in December at the winter meetings. And Anthony Nunez was the number one slam dunk guy that the Orioles were positively 100% going to add to the 40-man roster. They just didn't wait, the extra 8 days until the deadline. They just did it on Friday because they had space on the 40-man. They knew they were going to add him no matter what. So they said, hey, might as well do it now. Now, who is Anthony Nunez? Well, again, 24-year-old right-handed reliever who was acquired from the Mets in the Cedric Mullins trade at the deadline this year. Now, the Orioles got 3 pitchers back from the Mets in that deal, but Anthony Nunez quickly turned out to be, I would say, by far the best of the 3. And you could argue, if you kind of weigh heavily how quickly he'll be in the big leagues, maybe the most important piece the Orioles got at the deadline, because there's a really good chance Nunez helps the Orioles bullpen in 2026. And if you remember, I talked about it a lot kind of leading up to the trade deadline when it became clear the Orioles were going to be sellers. They were going to trade away a lot of their rental players like Cedric Mullins and others. I talked about how, it's always good to get the best talent possible. But for an Orioles team that's going to look to turn things around and compete again in 2026, I talked about how important it could be to get guys who will help the 2026 team. And especially with the Orioles trading away so many relievers, I thought it would be good to identify guys who could be relievers on next year's team. Nunez turned out to be one of those guys. Now, he also has been a very, very cool baseball story. Nunez, way back in 2019, was drafted by the Padres out of high school as a shortstop. He played 2.5 seasons in the Padres system, didn't hit at all, and was released in 2021. But he then used a bit of an interesting NCAA rule to actually go back and play college baseball. Because there is a rule that if you are drafted out of high school and you are released at any point, I believe without playing in the big leagues, you are eligible to go back and play college baseball as long as you play below the Division I level. So Nunez went and enrolled at Division II University of Tampa, one of the most successful Division II baseball programs in the country. Still was playing shortstop, but was slowly converting to be a two-way player. And eventually by his senior year was only a pitcher. And that got the eyes of some scouts. And after that 2024 season, the Mets signed him as a pitcher, as an undrafted free agent. And he just jumped up the system quickly as a reliever. They signed him in 2024, he started at the complex, then he went to low A to end the season. Then he started 2025 in high A, was dominant there. Then he threw 25 innings in double A for the Mets before that trade was made. He had a 2.10 ERA in those 25 innings with a 37% strikeout rate. So the Orioles said, we'll take this guy. He is currently ranked 29th in the Orioles system by Eric Longenhagen at FanGraphs among their prospects, giving him a 40 grade fastball, but a 60 grade slider with a 70 future grade on the 20 to 80 scale. That is a potential elite pitch that Nunez had. Now the Orioles got him. They put him in Double A Chesapeake for 1 game, and then they said, all right, that's good enough. You're going to Triple A for the first time. And to finish off the season in Triple A, Nunez was great. 15 2/3 innings in relief for the Norfolk Tides, had a 3.45 ERA with 21 strikeouts, just 7 walks in that time. And the stuff was incredible. You take a look at his Prospect Savant page. Prospect Savant, a great resource for AAA players, kind of mirroring what you see on a Major League Players Baseball Savant page. You can see like the strikeout rate he was posting at 34% was elite. Chase rate was elite. Swing and miss rate was at 40%, one of the best of any AAA pitchers this year. A super high swinging strike rate. He just missed bats at an elite level, and at just 24 years old, and a guy who really hasn't been pitching for that long, right? Like 3 years at most, is maybe a little bit of a fresher arm. You can think of it that way. It's really, really good stuff. He's got 4+ pitches, cutter, slider, 4-seam, and sinker. Also has a changeup that he throws in there as well. It probably needs some work, but it's maybe something that the Orioles can definitely work on with Nunez. But that 40% whiff rate is just absurd overall. He misses so many bats. His chase rate's high. The barrel rate's low. The hard hit rate is low. Some guys have squared him up from time to time, but he gives up so little contact that he's okay and able to get around it. And that slider from Nunez is the pitch that sets him apart. AAA hitters swung and missed 46% of the time against that pitch. That's absurd. He just a 17% hard hit rate against it. That is also absurd. And the expected slugging percentage was 135 against that slider for Nunez last year. It's insane how good that pitch was, to be honest. And when you think about a 46% swing and miss rate on a slider, just to put that into perspective of a major league pitcher, guys who have 46% whiff on their slider, how about Brian Abreu of the Astros? They're dominant kind of new ninth inning guy at this point, at least while Josh Hader was out, but their dominant setup man. That's the 7th highest whiff rate of any slider in Major League Baseball. That's what Anthony Nunez was doing. Now, again, he was doing it to AAA hitters, but that is a pitch that is already big league ready. And this move protects him from any other team scooping him up in the Rule 5 draft. And I could pretty much guarantee that a healthy Anthony Nunez probably going to pitch for the Orioles at some point in 2026. I'm not saying he's going to be in the opening day bullpen no matter what, but even with the addition of Andrew Kittredge, we know the Orioles bullpen has some open spots in it right now because of all the guys they traded away at last year's deadline. And the first guys they're going to look at are, once they get to spring training, who is already on our 40-man roster, between guys who are already here from last year, guys they acquire in the offseason, and guys like Nunez, who got added here in November. He's going to be in big league camp. He's going to be showing off his stuff. I wouldn't be surprised at all if he begins the year back in AAA Norfolk, because hopefully the Orioles this offseason build a good enough bullpen where they don't need Nunez initially. But he's going to be a young, optionable reliever with fiery stuff. He'll probably be up and down a few times, but I would not be shocked to see Anthony Nunez throw 20-ish innings for the Orioles bullpen next year. And if those innings go well, maybe by the end of the season, he's a real piece in that bullpen, getting big outs for the O's down the stretch. The stuff is really, really good. I would implore you to go watch some video of him in AAA. It's fun, the stuff that Nunez throws out there. The fastball is good velocity. The slider's just ridiculous, honestly. The cutter's really, really good as well. So it's an exciting mix. And another one of these interesting arms the Orioles have in AAA, and now being on the 40-man, he is really, truly knocking on the door of being a big league reliever for the Orioles next year. But with the moves like adding León and Nunez to the 40-man and the other guys who had to get added, the O's had a pretty full 40-man roster. They had to create a lot of space last week. So let's talk about all the players coming off the 40-man roster. That'll finish up the show coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA is back, and there is no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Even if you miss the start of the game or you want to ride the hot hand, FanDuel has live bets on everything from who will score next to fourth quarter comebacks. Plus, you can even combine your live bets into a same game parlay for a shot at a bigger payout. And it keeps every game exciting, especially when your team is making that late push. And right now, FanDuel is giving new customers $300 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. So just head to FanDuel.com to sign up and play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. So we will close out today's episode with a look at all the guys who came off the 40-man roster in the past week or so, because the Orioles had a full 40-man when the season ended, and you got to make some moves here, right? So the first three that are easy are Zach Eflin, Gary Sanchez, and Tomoyuki Sugano. Those all guys who officially hit free agency on Thursday and officially came off the 40-man roster. Those three are easy. I still think Eflin is probably the only one of the three the Orioles really have an interest in potentially bringing back on maybe like a one-year prove-it deal. I think Sugano and Sanchez are probably gone, but there were some more moves to make, because when you look at it, the Orioles added, right, Nunez and León, who we just talked about. They traded for Andrew Kittredge. They claimed George Soriano, the right-handed pitcher, on waivers that I talked about last week on Friday. And they also signed Leody Taveras to a one-year deal. That's 5 players going on the 40-man roster. Then the other spots you have to open is anyone who ended the season on the 60-day injured list. When you get put on the 60-day injured list, you no longer count against the 40-man roster, so your spot opens up. But as soon as the season ends, as soon as the World Series is over, you have to take all those guys who were on the 60-day IL and put them back on the 40-man roster to basically keep them in your organization. And those three players were Brandon Young, Grayson Rodriguez, and Felix Bautista, all had to be put back on the 40-man. So those were 8 spots that the Orioles essentially had to clear up this week. And that's at minimum, right? That's 8 spots just to get them to where they are now. And then you got to clear more spots when you start adding players this offseason as well. So this was really just kind of the first swing of these moves being made. So the first one was the Orioles DFA'd Jose Castillo, left-handed relief pitcher who the Orioles claimed off waivers last September. He actually pitched for 4 teams last year, did the 29-year-old. Came into the O's and was solid, 5 games, 7 1/3 innings, had a 2.45 ERA, but he was also arbitration eligible this offseason, was going to cost around $2 million. He was going to be a pretty easy non-tender candidate if the Orioles didn't DFA him already. They did do that, and his old team, the Mets, a team he pitched 16 games for last year and had a really good ERA, claimed him right back on waivers. So Castillo is now a New York Met. So there's 4 spots that were cleared up, right? Eflin, Sanchez, and Sugano, and Castillo. Next one is that it was announced that Dylan Carlson had become a free agent. Now, Dylan Carlson, after the Orioles did sign him to a 1-year, $1 million deal last offseason, actually still had 1 more year on his contract because he was still under arbitration. He was going to make, about $1.5 million for 2026. But Carlson wasn't very good anyway. Now, we've talked about this, right? Dylan Carlson played a lot more than the Orioles wanted him to. They never thought they would give 241 plate appearances to Dylan Carlson this year, and they thought if they had to, he wouldn't be as bad as a 203 average and a 74 WRC+, but that's what he was. And then after signing Leody Taveras to a 1-year deal, at worst, that is a guy who comes in and takes the Dylan Carlson role. Again, he was going to be a non-tender, so it seems like the Orioles just placed him on waivers early to see if anyone would scoop him up or they could make a trade or whatever it may be. They did not. And he now, even earlier than they thought, becomes a free agent. He was probably going to be one anyway. So there's 5 spots that have opened. Daniel Johnson also cleared waivers. Now, we already knew about that one. He was DFA'd when the Orioles went and claimed George Soriano. So we'll see if the Orioles want to bring Daniel Johnson back to the organization at any point as he becomes a free agent. Shawn Dubin was also kind of quietly placed on waivers, and then he was not claimed. He eventually cleared waivers just like Johnson did. Dubin was someone who the Orioles claimed in late August off waivers from the Astros. Right-handed reliever, had a 3.38 ERA in 8 innings out of the bullpen for the Orioles, then suffered an elbow injury in September and was out for the season. We still don't, I think, know the full severity of his injury, but he was outrighted to AAA. He stays in the organization for now, so we'll see kind of what that injury looks like for Dubin. We know Jorge Mateo officially became a free agent. The Orioles declined his $5.5 million team option last week. I'm not closing the book on it because as much as the Orioles seem to love him, there's always a chance they bring Mateo back on a minor league deal, let him compete for a spot in spring training, or at least closer to the end of the Jorge Mateo run here in Baltimore, but he officially came off the roster. And then 2 more DFAs. Josh Walker was DFA'd by the Orioles, left-handed reliever who came over on waivers last year, but only pitched in AAA and then got injured. The Orioles had just upped his salary for this exact reason to try and get him to pass through waivers. Don't think we have the update on Josh Walker. I'll do kind of a live check here, but as we speak, I believe he is still sitting on waivers at the moment because the Orioles upped his earnings for next year. Maybe it's more likely he does clear waivers. And the Orioles can keep him in the organization. And the other guy who was DFA'd was right-handed pitcher Carson Ragsdale, who the Orioles actually claimed 2 different times off waivers last season. Pitched twice for the Orioles. Remember, had to eat it in that mop-up game against the Blue Jays and then get DFA'd the next day. The Orioles did bring him back at that point, but again, we'll kind of see what his waiver process looks like and whether or not the Orioles will hold on to them. But at the end of the day, they made all the space they needed. I believe the 40-man roster is actually sitting at 39 players right now, so there is even 1 open spot, which is nice to kind of begin the full part of the offseason with as well. And if you do look at the Orioles 40-man roster, as I mentioned, there's going to be more guys that go. There's not only going to be one player out of the 40-man. There's probably going to be a couple other prospects who get added to protect them from the Rule 5 draft. There's going to be a few other waiver claims we know the Orioles are going to make. And whether it's signings, whether it's trades, they got to bring in some big league talent this offseason, and that's going to make them open up some spots as well. So Pedro León, who was just claimed, like, he's probably going to go soon. They'll hope they can hold on to him. Ryan Noda, remember him, briefly played at the end of the season. He's still holding on to a 40-man spot. That won't be long. Maverick Handley's 40-man spot is probably going to be up for grabs here sometime soon. Even George Soriano, who was also recently claimed off waivers, could probably go sometime soon. Then you got some other guys like Jose Espada, who pitched just one game for the Orioles last year. Someone like Colin Selby, who struggled with some injuries. Albert Suarez, who we know struggled with injuries. Maybe if the O's don't want to keep a third catcher in Alex Jackson, he could go. Luis Vasquez has that higher salary to kind of protect against this at this point. So there's definitely some spots that could easily be open. Like, don't worry that the Orioles have 39 of their 40 spots filled right now. There are still some fairly easy and non-painful moves to make to open those spots when the Orioles do start to hopefully make some signings here, right? We had the Ken Rosenthal and Will Salmon piece in The Athletic on Monday, kind of breaking down the Kyle Tucker free agency. Seems to be the number one bat in free agency, and they put the Orioles in the kind of sleeper team tier for Kyle Tucker. I pretty much don't think there's any chance the Orioles actually do sign Kyle Tucker this offseason, but it's nice to think about, right? And, through Rosenthal's reporting, he said multiple sources have said the Orioles are planning to spend this offseason and are also willing and interested in spending on a big bat in free agency, which is something we haven't heard as much, I guess, directly from sources to this point. So that's always positive too. And we'll see what the O's can do in free agency. And unless we get more news, like potentially more coaching hires or more waiver claims, we're going to kind of jump into the free agency portion of this podcast on the offseason starting tomorrow. I do my free agency wish lists for basically every position the Orioles are looking at, and I will continue to do those this offseason. But what I wanted to do first is look back on all of last year's wish lists, because I give my personal opinion on who the Orioles should sign. If my opinion stinks and I continuously rank bad players number one, why would you listen to me? So we're going to do a little bit of auditing on my previous lists on tomorrow's episode to see how good or bad I was at kind of ranking the free agents last year that the Orioles should have gone after. And then we'll jump into making those wish lists for this year. But that's coming up on tomorrow's episode. Until then, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube page. Make sure to subscribe and follow wherever you listen. If you can leave a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, that really, really helps out the show. And if you ever want to talk some Orioles, talk some ball, you got mailbag questions, general questions, feedback for the podcast, whatever it may be, always glad to respond to your emails. You can email me, lockedonorioles@gmail.com. We jump into the free agency pool tomorrow, but until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.